April 13th, 1945. On the outskirts of Weimar, Germany, spring had arrived as if the war itself had already ended. The sun was warm, birds were loud in the trees, and the air carried the smell of fresh grass instead of smoke. A column of American soldiers from the 80th Infantry Division moved cautiously up a quiet road and stopped in front of a large villa perched behind iron gates. It looked untouched by war. No shell craters. No broken windows. Just elegance and silence. One soldier kicked the door open, expecting resistance. None came. Inside, the house felt unreal. Thick Persian rugs softened every footstep. Crystal chandeliers caught the sunlight and scattered it across white walls hung with expensive paintings. The smell in the air wasn't gunpowder or decay. It was perfume, French, expensive, carefully chosen. This wasn't the home of a desperate Nazi official fleeing the collapse of the Reich. It was the home of luxury, confidence, and indulgence. And it belonged to Ilsa Koch, the wife of the former commandant of Buchenwald concentration camp, the woman prisoners had whispered about for years, the woman they feared more than many guards. They called her the Witch of Buchenwald. The soldiers began their search methodically. Closets, bedrooms, drawers. They were looking for SS officers hiding in civilian clothes. They were looking for weapons, documents, anything of intelligence value. Then, in a quiet study at the back of the house, an American sergeant stopped. On a polished wooden table stood a lamp. At first glance, it looked tasteful, even elegant. The base was carved wood. The shade was pale, almost translucent, glowing softly in the daylight. It looked like fine leather. The sergeant reached out and touched it. Something felt wrong. It wasn't like cowhide or goatskin. It was thinner, warmer, uncomfortably smooth. He leaned closer and felt his stomach tighten. Beneath the surface were faint lines, curves and patterns that didn't belong on any animal. He stepped back and called out, "Document! You need to see this." The medic examined the lamp carefully. Then he turned to the shelves. Book covers. Gloves laid neatly on a desk. He ran his fingers over them, his face draining of color. He swallowed hard and looked back at the sergeant. "Sarge," he said quietly, "that's not leather." The room seemed to shrink. "That's human skin." The soldiers recoiled in disbelief. Some cursed. Others stood frozen, staring at the objects as if they might move. This wasn't just the home of an enemy officer's wife. This was a house of trophies. A house decorated with the remains of murdered men. To understand how something like this could exist, you have to go back to the height of Nazi power, when the camps were not just instruments of death, but personal playgrounds for those who ran them. Ilsa Koch wasn't a soldier. She didn't wear a uniform or hold a rank. Before the Nazis, she had been a secretary, ordinary, forgettable. But she married power. Her husband, Karl Koch, was the commandant of Buchenwald. Their villa stood just outside the camp fence. On one side, starvation, disease, torture, and smoke from the crematorium. On the other, garden parties, horses, wine, and music. It was a surreal division of worlds, and Ilsa reveled in it. Survivors remembered her vividly. She rode her horse through the campgrounds during inspections, her red hair visible from a distance, her riding clothes tailored and clean. In her hand, she carried a whip, sometimes tipped with razor blades. If a prisoner looked at her, she might slash his face. If a prisoner looked away, she might whip him for disrespect. There was no right choice. The cruelty was the point. She dressed provocatively, deliberately, knowing the men she passed were starving, skeletal, barely human anymore. If someone dared to glance at her, She would note his number. That prisoner would often vanish within days. No explanation. No record. But her cruelty went beyond beatings and humiliation. It became something colder. Something deliberate. Among the prisoners, a rumor spread, quietly at first, then with growing fear. Hide your skin. Cover your arms. Don't let her see your tattoos. Ilsa Koch was obsessed with tattoos. In the 1930s and 40s, tattoos were uncommon. They marked sailors, criminals, political radicals. Buchenwald held many of these men, and their bodies carried stories in ink, ships, names, dates, eagles, lovers remembered. To Ilsa, they weren't memories. They were art. She attended medical inspections personally. Prisoners were stripped naked and forced to stand in lines in the cold, shivering as guards watched. Ilsa walked slowly down the rows like a shopper browsing shelves. She wasn't looking for illness. She was looking for designs. When she saw a tattoo she liked, a detailed ship across a chest, a bold eagle on a shoulder, she would smile. She would turn to the camp doctor and ask calmly, "Is this specimen healthy?" If the answer was yes, the man's fate was sealed. He wasn't sent back to work. He wasn't punished publicly. He was sent to the pathology lab. When American forces liberated Buchenwald, they found that lab intact. What they discovered inside stunned even hardened combat veterans. Shelves lined with glass jars filled with alcohol. Floating inside were squares of human skin, carefully preserved. Hundreds of them. Some bore birds. Some had names, dates, symbols. Each one catalogued like a scientific sample. But the jars were only part of it. Witnesses later testified that Ilsa Koch demanded more than preserved specimens. She wanted usable objects. Lampshades. Book bindings. Gloves. Wall decorations. All made from tanned human skin taken from prisoners she personally selected. Imagine the psychology required to sit in a living room, reading a book bound in a murdered man's flesh, illuminated by the skin of another. When General Patton toured the camp and saw the evidence, he reportedly called it the work of animals. Eisenhower ordered everything filmed, fearing no one would believe it later. Then there was something even worse. In the lab were shrunken human heads, reduced to the size of fists, preserved like grotesque trophies. One belonged to a Polish prisoner caught trying to escape. Testimony claimed Ilsa kept them as paperweights. By 1945, the world she thrived in was collapsing. Her husband was already dead, executed by the SS not for murder, but for corruption and stealing from the Nazi state. That was the one crime the regime punished. Ilsa fled, attempting to disappear into civilian life, moving in with family and pretending to be nothing more than an officer's widow. But the survivors remembered her. When Buchenwald was liberated, prisoners poured out their stories. Intelligence officers heard the same name again and again. The red-haired woman. The whip. The tattoos. The lamp. On August 19, 1945, American MPs arrested her. She acted shocked. Innocent. "I'm just a woman," she said. "I never hurt anyone. I had no rank." She played the role of a victim perfectly. But the Americans had evidence. Objects. Testimony. Survivors willing to point at her across a courtroom. In 1947, she stood trial before an American military tribunal alongside SS officers and camp doctors. She was the only woman among them, and she drew all the attention. Reporters called her the Witch of Buchenwald. In court, the prosecution laid out the evidence. Skin. Heads. Witnesses who described watching her select victims. Ilsa denied everything. She claimed the skin was animal hide. She claimed it was propaganda. She never wavered. She was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. It seemed like justice. Then, in 1948, General Lucius D. Clay reviewed her case. A lawyer by instinct, he focused on technicalities. Some physical evidence had disappeared. Witness testimony didn't always meet strict legal standards. Against the outrage of the public, he reduced her sentence to 4 years. When Americans heard the news, fury erupted. Newspapers exploded with headlines. Survivors protested. Senators demanded answers. But the decision stood. In October 1949, Ilsa Koch walked out of prison smiling. She didn't realize the Germans were waiting. West German authorities arrested her immediately and charged her with murder under German law. This trial was relentless. More witnesses. More details. No sympathy. In 1951, she was sentenced to life imprisonment with no parole. This time, there would be no escape. She spent 16 years in a women's prison, growing increasingly delusional, insisting she was the real victim. In 1967, alone in her cell, she took her own life. She died as she lived, unrepentant. The lamp itself vanished. Destroyed, hidden, stolen, no one knows for sure. But the story remains. Not as a myth, but as a warning. Because when the American soldiers kicked down that door in 1945, they didn't just uncover a crime. They uncovered the truth about how ordinary people, given absolute power, can descend into absolute evil. And that is something history will never let us forget.